While Russia loudly claims victories it has not achieved, Ukraine is quietly doing something far more important, taking territory back. After more than 100 days of heavy fighting, Ukraine's defense forces have liberated 5 villages in the Dnepropetrovsk region. And this fits into a much wider picture. What Ukraine has achieved in 2025 would have seemed impossible just a year ago. The battlefield has expanded far beyond the front line, with strikes on Russian oil infrastructure, operations at sea and long-range attacks deep in the rear, all aimed at weakening the economic engine of Russia's war. Joining me in the studio is Shaun, a former British Army soldier and Ukrainian Marine. Shaun, it's my pleasure to have you here. Hi, hello.
It's great to be back on again. Seems to be a regular thing now. It's good.
So, Shaun, I don't want to be dramatic, but this is our last interview in 2025. And when we look at this year as a whole, reclaimed villages, strikes at sea, long-range operations, how would you describe the overall state of the war right now? Is Ukraine slowly shifting the balance, even if it doesn't always look dramatic on the map?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, I've just written a paper saying exactly that. If you go back to 2022, even when I was in Mariupol, then you know, you had Russia with their dominance, you know, flying planes into Ukraine. And we were very reactive in 2022 while Russia was steamrolling, making good progress at the start. However, you know, fast forward to 2025, the whole dynamics have really changed. I'm not saying that Ukraine's going to march into Mariupol and start putting up defense positions. What I'm saying now is that if you go back to 2022 and you look at where we are now, we have drones going into Russia on a daily basis. Also, ballistic missiles hitting oil refineries, ammunition dumps, command nodes, logistics hubs, and even a Kilo-class submarine quite recently. So, you know, Ukraine is now taking the fight to Russia inside Russia and starting to shape the battlefield from inside Russia. So, yeah, we're in a totally different area. We still have our problems in Ukraine, but essentially, you know, look at the extra work that Russia's doing with their propaganda. Now, look at Pokrovsk, look at Kupiansk, look at the extremes. They are going to say they are conquering villages and they're not, you know, and Zelensky's gone in straight after that announcement to say, nope, that's not happening. I'm here. You know, even Pokrovsk, when everybody had written that off, I was saying several weeks ago, you know, Putin was inviting journalists to Pokrovsk to show the encirclement and the capture of the town. And that's just not materialized. You know, they're still fighting for it now. So going into next year, you know, we're not in that same place as we were at the beginning of last year. You know, we didn't even know whether we'd be around in the summer. You know, ammunition supplies were low, artillery shells were stopped, you know, all before Trump even started his presidency. So, you know, we've been in far worse positions and far worse situations, and now we're making grounds, taking the whole of Kupiansk this week.
Yeah, and some international media say that Ukrainian strikes almost 2,000 kilometers away, including beyond the Black Sea, are effectively opening a second front. Can we really describe it that way?
Well, no, I don't know whether it's a second front. I think essentially you would be hitting supply routes and logistics routes and hubs anyway as in a full-scale war. Essentially, what it's done is made everywhere in Russia very achievable in sending rockets, long-range drones and ballistics. There's nothing in Russia that really can't be hit at the moment. So, you know, and it's affected their economy going into the new year. That's no secret now. You know, Russia's had to go begging to India to get a workforce, North Korea to get a workforce. You've got to remember that Ukraine is fighting a coalition of, you know, China to some degree, North Korea, Iran. You know, this is remarkable. And Ukraine have really what's really not reported about in the news is those hits so much in Russia. We've had assassinations of generals. It's getting to the point where Putin can't protect infrastructure, he can't protect his police, he can't protect his generals. I mean, this is really bad for Putin, and I don't think we really talk about that enough. It's essentially one of the biggest victories that Ukraine has had is that, yourself, Russia had dominance of the Black Sea. That's not the case anymore. Now, Ukraine has fought tooth and nail around the Black Sea and Crimea, and essentially Putin's had to withdraw his navy from there, the Black Sea fleet from there, because it's decimated. And they say Ukraine doesn't have a navy. I was a Ukrainian Marine. It does have a navy. Probably the best way to describe it is a modern day navy. It's changed naval warfare forever. It's now using drones to attack subs while they're moored up in their harbours, and you've seen the videos and the clips of the surface-to-air defence systems that have been taken out in Crimea. So, this whole war. It's Ukraine's innovation that's keeping them in the fight, and let's hope that continues.
Oh, let's hope for that. But, I mean, the Ukrainian military says it struck an oil refinery in Russia's Rostov region on Christmas Day, just yesterday, using British-supplied Storm Shadow missiles. Shaun, could you have imagined something like this being possible 1 or 2 years ago?
No, absolutely not. You remember there was a big question. Biden had these questions about what we could use, and, he was worried so much about escalation. And that's my whole point. The power shift is significantly moved to Ukraine. And I've got to be careful how I say that. I don't want to give false hope that, we're going to start steamrolling to the Azov Sea and taking back Crimea and going into Mariupol. But we have got our problems, but it has, shifted considerably. Russia can't act their will anymore. They can't move forward. They're stuck. They're bogged down in, after 11 years, can't even take Donetsk Oblast. So, he's pushing the political side now to hopefully push Trump into giving them that region. But, and that's because they can't take it militarily. So they're struggling. Russia's in really a dire straits with I don't think it's going to change Putin's plans. He's still going to keep pushing forward. He's got no other choice. His economy's on a war footing. He's bogged down in Donbass. He hasn't reached any of his reasons or goals for invading Ukraine yet. So after 4 years of fighting, 1.1 million Russian casualties, they're starting to feel it in Russia. And again, the propaganda is working overdrive now to try and hide that and what's going on in Russia, when yourself, we still know what's going on in the occupied territories. People talk to people, and we know they're struggling.
Yes, and if Ukraine continues at this pace, what kind of successes do you realistically expect next year?
I've never been in any doubt that we could essentially exhaust Russia. I mean, when I was in Mariupol, that was the sole aim. Even in a 200-kilometer encirclement, we had to keep fighting because we knew we had to exhaust their capabilities. And afterwards, when people were telling me that if we hadn't held out in Mariupol for so long, then Russia could have taken Kiev. So Ukraine has always fought for time. The Western media doesn't really understand that concept. And this day and age, people want instant wins. And I absolutely still 100% believe that we can absolutely exhaust Russia long before Ukraine is in that position, because we've always been in that position, relied upon our partners and support, whereas Russia's now creaking at the seams. It's 40% of its federal budget is made up of oil and gas. When you start knocking out refineries and you start knocking out their shadow fleet, that's going to have an impact very, very quickly, and that's starting to show. So, essentially, if Russia's economy collapses, we could end up walking back into the occupied territories, without a shot being fired. If an army's not going to get paid, it's not going to fight, essentially.
Yes, right. And just getting back to the very complicated issue right now, it's Donbass. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War say that the Kremlin is exaggerating its battlefield successes, and that at the current pace, Russia would need years and enormous losses to take the rest of the Donetsk region. From your military experience, does Russia actually have the capacity to reach its maximum goals, or has this war become more about endurance than breakthroughs?
Well, it hasn't reached any of its goals or its reasons for invading, as I said, in 2022. So, any peace deal that does get struck is going to be a real failure for Putin to try and sell that to the people, and the amount of losses. And I mean, globally, strategically, Russia is a weaker player on the global stage. I mean, Ukraine has really shown how weak Russia is. It can hit everywhere in Russia, and they've shown that to the West. And now, even Ukraine it was always been about in Ukraine about what they can produce domestically, innovations they can make to win the war. And now they're selling those innovations and that technology to allied countries and partners. So, they're doing exceptionally well. The propaganda, like you said, we touched on it earlier, it's just, gone up sixfold in the last 6 months, I would say, because it's really disguising Putin's losses. Pokrovsk being one of them. I mean, it's just really, and Kupiansk recently, has just shown really what Russia hasn't moved. Russia hasn't moved very far forward since the Second World War, The Statue of Liberty is kaput. It's pretty much old school propaganda like that. It's just this modern day and age with geolocations and, mill bloggers, they can spot quickly, very, very quickly when, that's not the case. You look at deep state, it's very quick to point out, when Russia's lying. So, and we've known that in Ukraine for quite a long while. I don't think people in America essentially have that understanding that we have, of what Russia actually is and how far they will go and sacrifice people. I mean, we call it the flag run. They will quite happily send 2 or 3 people to pop a flag, 200 or 300 meters in front to say they've taken it. And then those guys will get killed instantly, because there's not a part of the front line that's not monitored or watched. So generally, Russia's struggling to break through. They don't have the vehicles, they don't have the artillery, they don't have the infantry. So they're just, Putin's must be at his limits now. How far, we don't know. But generally, I mean, there's only so much the Russians are going to accept before they start turning on him. And we must be very close to that now.
Yes, actually, my question is about the peace talks and all this loud process that's happening. How do you assess everything that's going on right now? The Ukrainian president just said that before the new year will be released some important information. How do you see it?
I can't see Russia wanting any peace, as I said before, because essentially they haven't reached any of their goals. NATO's grown because of the invasion, so that's one of the reasons he wanted to invade, to stop NATO expansion. Well, that's grown with Finland and Sweden. Has he collapsed the regime? No. Is he any closer to it? No. I mean, he's not. He's taken Mariupol. He still can't take Dnepropetrovsk. I mean, he's not, denazify. I mean, I tell people quite a lot, he invaded with Nazi groups like Rusich. So essentially, I don't think he's going to achieve any of the goals that he set out, and the reasons for his invasion of Ukraine. I can't see him reaching any of them because Ukraine's got stronger in a way with the innovations and the way they run it. We don't get me wrong. We have our own problems, which we've talked about before. Also, manning. Do we have enough people? We've got to look at that and keep on top of that. Essentially, we're reliant on partners, but that reliance is becoming less and less. We're now 60% producing our own equipment to fight Russia inside Ukraine. So that's got to improve. That's, there's still room for improvement there, and the partners are helping us to do that. So it's essential that we should look and explore every peace option. However, when one side doesn't clearly want peace and is not gearing up for it, not willing to make any concessions, you can't make peace with somebody that wants to exterminate you. You just can't. It's just not going to happen. So, so I think the Americans are going to realize that at some point, and we can't exactly just say no to Trump straight away. We've got to go through that system and those meetings and make as many concessions as we can within the realms of what's acceptable to the Ukrainian people. But essentially, we're going to always come back to the fact that Putin doesn't want peace. He wants Kiev. He's always wanted Kiev. We've known that from the start, and he's not going to stop until he gets it.
But at the same time, Moscow was not attacking Kiev on Christmas Eve. There was a sound sirens, but still they were not attacking the Ukrainian capital, but they were attacking other cities, Chernihiv, Odessa region, Dnipro region. So what message do they send to the world? Like if the capital was not attacking that what?
Well, I mean, literally, I've just been to Kharkiv, and to touch on that point, I was exactly talking about the same thing as you just alluded to. The fact that when the last time we went to Kharkiv, they were just hitting everywhere. Suddenly, there's a shift. Now they're going for more strategic targets, power systems, civilian infrastructure, substations. Eventually it will change back like it normally does. They're only doing that because of the cold weather, and they want to break the back of the Ukrainian people. They haven't changed that stance for 4 years. They did exactly the same thing now as they did in 2022. If you keep doing the same thing and it doesn't work, the chances are you're going to get the same result. And that's what Russia's essentially doing. So at some point in the new year, they will switch back to military bases. They'll switch back to, residential areas, more terrorizing, and they will probably look to a spring offensive too, which means that they're gearing up for that now. So it could expect probably a spring offensive when the weather turns. I just can't see any end to it, unless Putin makes some sort of concessions, which it doesn't look like he's going to do. In any sort of negotiation, if you're going to demand maximalist demands, then you need leverage. And at the moment, the longer this goes on, the less leverage Mr. Putin has, to be fair. He's in a worse state now than he was in 2022 with probably his second army. Now his economy is flatlining and, struggling to meet the federal budget. Then, at some point, it's got to call time on it. And I think we just need to keep pushing through.
So we are not approaching to some pause at war?
We could. I certainly would think that would benefit Russia more than Ukraine at the moment. I think even if we had a ceasefire, we couldn't trust that ceasefire. I mean, I've been in the trenches when the Minsk agreement was in place and blogged and reported at the time saying, we seem to be restricted on how many weapons and ammunition we can have on points, yet the Russians and the separatists, the Russian-backed separatists we were fighting, just seemed to open up whenever they wanted, and I was reporting that in 2018, 2019. So, I've seen Russia lifetime break these ceasefires and break these, agreements. And look at the Budapest Memorandum. I mean, when you talk about putting, I will not attack the EU in a legal framework, I'm sure the Budapest Memorandum was a legal framework, So, while Putin remains in power, I think, there's not going to be any peace deal or ceasefire that's worth any salt at the moment. I mean, I just think, Russia seems to have a ceasefire when it suits them, like the May Day parades, because they're worried about, Ukraine hitting or droning them through their parades. But suddenly they can't have a Christmas ceasefire, because it's they don't want the Ukrainians to regroup and reorganize. Please, they just don't want it. They just don't want peace. Having been on the other side, they're imperialistic by nature. They see Kiev as their main target, and then they will move on to Poland and Moldova and the grey areas. I mean, this is about imperialism at the end of the day. Russian imperialism. And, I likened it to a slave owner that really just wants his slaves back. And that's it. There's, you're not brothers. He's pushing on. He still wants Kiev. That's not going to change. Even with a ceasefire and a peace deal, you're still going to have his clandestine units and working overtime to try and elect someone that they can control. And I think Zelensky called his bluff when he said, I'll have an election. No problems at all, I'll have an election. I think he really did call his bluff, because then suddenly the Russians weren't interested in an election because they can't control it. So I think Zelensky's doing very well with the cards in the hand he's got, ever so well, to challenge, even to the point of saying, great, we'll pull out of Donbass. If Russia mirror us, then we'll pull out of Donbass. But Russia has to come out of Donbass too. Again, Russia are not keen on that because they want Kiev, and that's not going to change.
And at the same time, the leader of the European Parliament's largest political group, Manfred Weber, and he just recently said that Germany should deploy troops in Ukraine under the EU flag after a potential ceasefire. He argues Europe cannot expect the United States alone to guarantee peace. How realistic and how important is this idea?
I've always been an advocate that NATO and Europe should spend more on the defence, and you can't expect America to pay for it all. I've always agreed with Trump on that, essentially. So it is about time for Europe to really step up and try to do something about it. I mean, they've had plenty of opportunities with Ukraine, and since the full-scale invasion, and before to step up their spends. And it is a real problem. It's not just America; it's Europe failing to step up to that. I think they're cranking their gears now. I think it's been a slow process, but certainly, with what's happening, I think Russia's main job is to divide, push a divide between Europe and America. So essentially, that's their main goal, and you could see that happening now, lifetime, more now than ever. Putin's trying to separate Trump and America from Europe. So, the war is essentially a global war, whether people decide to accept it or not. It's involving China, Iran, North Korea. It's involving most of Europe now that support Ukraine. So essentially, it is growing. It is a war that's involved a lot of countries and could change very quickly. So it is important that all peace needs to be really looked at and every avenue explored. However, I just don't think, Putin really wants it, and we're going to be back to square one, and Europe's just going to have to step up and man up and put its big boy pants on and start, helping Ukraine win this war, because it's going to be drastic if they don't. They're going to have an even bigger problem if Russia is successful in Ukraine. So, and probably spend far more.
Right. So looking ahead to 2026, with Ukraine holding the line, striking deeper and adapting faster, what does the West still misunderstand about Ukraine's real strength? And what kind of support actually matters most going forward?
I think there's a lot of support in America. I think it's the administration have got a very limited and quite a minority in their lack of support for Ukraine. I'm not exactly. I think America's going through its own problems. So essentially, we can't rely upon America at the moment as a stable partner. We need them on board, though, and we, I think most people. I speak for most people. We're greatly appreciative of what they've done so far. However, Europe needs to step up. It's on their plate. It's on their doorstep. They've got to understand. And I think they're behind the times in the information war too. I think they're playing a considerable amount of catching up in that. Putin's seems to be having a win in the propaganda front, with a lot of misinformation about actually what Russia's doing in Ukraine, which is why even myself, we're trying to get people over to America to talk in the American press, Ukrainians, survivors, people on the front lines, to talk about how it's affecting them and what it's like here and what Russia's done to them. And we're meeting barriers with that. So Russia's got its tentacles everywhere, and I think all we can do is keep pushing out the information of what's happening on the ground here, and Europe needs to step up with its support to help Ukraine, win this war. And essentially, I think, with more sanctions and more pressure economically, I think, Russia could very well, collapse without support from, could get support from China, who knows? But, I think we're way off the end of this war yet. I can't see anything that's going to scream at me about a peace deal or a ceasefire in the imminent future. So we'll just have to see. And if I'm wrong, which I hope I am, let's make that clear. I think, if there is a ceasefire or a peace deal that's mutually agreed, it would tell me that Russia's in a far more precarious situation than they're willing to let on, because I can't see why, if they're winning so well and they're taking all these places in Ukraine, why they would want to stop. Surely they would want to meet their goals. And that is Putin, unfortunately. He will use a ceasefire and a peace deal to reorganize.
Yes. Yeah, so fingers crossed for Ukrainian army's victory in 2026. And for now, thank you so much for your time, Shaun, and see you next time in 2026.